Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to start now. I'll quickly share my screen. Just let me know if you can see my screen.
I can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Welcome to our series of learning meetup that we are organizing as the Cape Town Hub. This is a journey that we just started to discuss systems innovation guide. Past few weeks, we explored systems awareness, systems innovation guide. This week, we'll be exploring complexity theory guide and complex adaptive system. The link to the guide, I will provide them in the chat. We will start quickly by introducing the team. My name is Arsene, and I will be facilitating the session today. This is going to be just a discussion, but in the team, I'm the hub lead. In the team, I'm not alone. So there's Linda, Sheldon, and Lee. And that's from part of the core team. And as I said, today we'll be exploring complexity theory. So this guide has 4 key components. We'll be looking at self-organization, non-linear systems, network theory, and adaptive systems. Before we start, I think it will be good to ask everybody, and I believe we took time to read the guide. I will ask one of you to just tell us their understanding of what is complex system, because that's where we're starting. Yeah, anyone who wants to start by telling us what they understand by complex system?
I'll give it a go. Yeah, the picture that you put there that was on your screen, maybe if you can put it up again. I feel like it's a very good example of a complex system. It's showing mostly what we're seeing there is the transport system within a city. But there are also vendors there who are doing their own thing. And that city actually also has its political systems, its health systems. There are a lot of other systems that are involved within a city like this. And a lot of stakeholders also involved, a lot of actors, if I can put it like that, yeah. So I think a complex system is basically a system of comprising of many other systems. I don't know, yeah, that's my own understanding.
Yes, I was actually going to agree with Linda, because my idea would also be a system composed of different parts that interact with each other, like the Earth's global system interacting with climates, organisms, or the human brain or infrastructure. Yeah.
Exactly. Good point. Yeah, Linda, the picture that you just made to talk about is actually that's Lagos, the city of Lagos in West Africa, in Nigeria. It's a way of describing exactly complex system, but showing transportation as a complex system as well. So when we talk about complex system, we're thinking of set of models for understanding complex systems. And this all, I'm sure you got a chance to see it as you were going through the guide. It starts from, or it's a combination of mathematical modeling frameworks that help understand complex systems. And so when we say mathematics, we mean the study of patterns. I think that's an important point that we need to mention here. Because complexity theory is the mathematical modeling of complex patterns, how they emerge, how they evolve, how they come together.
I think yes. Martin has his hand up.
Oh, yeah, look.
Okay, yes. Martin, you can go ahead if you want to add something here. Yes, go ahead. You're muted. You're muted, Martin.
Martin,
you're muted. We can't hear you, Martin.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Martin.
Hello, Switzerland. Listen, I have a question because it's important for me to follow the discussion further. In my opinion, or what I understand is, you have different types of systems. Let's put it this way. You have, for example, transportation, you have a finance system, food system, whatever you call it. It's I call this is a physical system or material, and there is organization, a government, you know, the UN or any organization that you see. It's also a system. It's also, both are complex, but they are totally different to handle and to approach. A living system, or a system with humans, or a system with rules, with patterns, whatever you want to call it. It's, for me, it's a different type of system. So my question is about which type you're talking about, the transportation and finance system, or what kind of system, type of system you're talking?
Thank you so much.
Okay.
That's an important question, Martin. So we're starting by introducing the system in general. And then as we be discussing, then we can start taking examples, because as we're talking about complexity theory, so we start with complex systems. And as we unpack it, then we get to understand the system itself. And the question that you are asking is coming at the right point, because the next question that we were going to discuss, according to the guide, is to understand what is a complex system itself. So when you get to unpack the complex system itself, then you get now to define the property, because a complex system is a system that has a set of parts and relations between those parts that interconnect them into a whole and making them interdependent in that whole system. So if you talk about finance systems, then you start to think of who are the actors, and those become then your properties, and you start seeing the role that they are playing within the system. You can take it in the transportation system as well. You can take city also as a system that is made of various elements, that is made of parts. And what we're going to study here is to understand the relationship between those parts, how they interact. And that's how we're going to bring out that complexity to now start digging down to the various components that we mentioned. So we will start by that, understanding the system, and get to understand how the principles and the rules of the complex systems. So we talk about self-organizations, we will talk about non-linearity, and we can go down to take system by system. It can be, as you mentioned, finance system, and any that is there. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Okay, I just also wanted to add something there. Thanks, Martin, so much for your question. I feel like those systems that you mentioned, you gave as an example, what also brings the complexity is the interconnectedness and the interrelatedness of those systems. So if you're looking at transport, for example, then you understand that, and I'll go back to the picture that was the, you understand that those vendors, for them to go get their supplies, they need transport. If you're looking at the health of the health system, obviously transport is a very important factor in the health system. And if you're looking at how government operates, transport is also very crucial. So the interconnectedness of those systems brings about complexity.
Yeah. And we can go further down. In fact, that's the next step. As we were discussing complex systems, they also need to understand that we deal with simple systems and complex systems. Yes, Martin, I see you just raise your hand again. Maybe you have a comment or question to make based on that. Or comment or question. Go ahead, Martin, please. You are muted.
I still have a question. You know, if we agree and say we have two types of system. One is a non-living system, like transportation, like financial health system. These are non-living system, okay? And a human and organization, a government, or the world organization or world community is a living system, okay? And a living system has the approach to be as complex as possible. You need the complexity because you have to be more complex than your environment. But for a non-living system, like the health system, like the finance system, like the transportation system, you have the approach from the beginning to make it simpler, you know? To make it simple. But if you make a human simpler, then his environment will not survive. If you make an organization simpler, less complex than the environment, your organization is probably not able to survive. So in the beginning, if you're talking about the relation and how this the system is has independency or relation, or how this works together, it's, in my opinion, completely different. It's a completely different approach how you handle a non-living or a living system. But what I understand is you're talking about a non-living system, then I'm fine and I can follow the discussion. I just want to know if you do if you separate or approach these two types of system different.
Yeah. Did you get the chance to look at the guide?
Yes.
Yeah, right? Did you read the guide?
Yes.
Yeah.
But this question was not answered for me if you're talking about the living system or a non-living system.
No, there is a reason why I'm asking if you get the chance to read the guide. So let me just clarify that the purpose of this conversation is to unpack the complexity theory guide. And if I have to go back here, I will go back to your question as you mentioned, right? So we are not taking a particular system and break it down. That's not what we are going to do here, right? So we're just looking at system in general, right? So if we start here, we're starting with the concept of complexity theory, how it emerged, and how it moved from self-organization and going further down to become more non-linear systems, and the relationship and the part and how they interact in that process, and how it emerged to create what we call network theory and move to adaptive systems. So if we want to go deep to discuss living and non-living system, that will be maybe something that we will have now to take a particular, and that's we do it often when we're doing a sort of workshop, where we take a particular system, living or non-living, and we start breaking it down. And we get to the point now of understanding the elements of those systems, identifying them, naming them and calling them, and get to understand how they interrelate and how they influence that system and what result it produces, right? And again, just let me also clarify that this guide it's a summary of, we're not going to cover everything under complexity theory. I'm sure you know that is quite broad. So we just have 1 hour here. In this 1 hour, the idea is to go look at those contexts, concepts that are in the guide, and try and unpack it and get a shared understanding on how they operate, so that when we have to deal with a particular system, then it becomes easier for us.
Martin, I think I can answer your question for you. I think it applies to both non-living and living systems, because what complexity theory does is it's supposed to model the like dependencies, like, so it's supposed to model or give us insight into these complex systems, human or not human. So it's just like, yeah, so it applies to both. I think that's what, if that's what helps you answer your question more.
Yeah,
So
but also
Bridget,
the reality is, you know, when you deal with systems, the principles are the same, the rules are the same, the way they function, it's the same. So you don't change it, to be perfectly honest. They're the same. So it's about understanding. So when we move on later on to speak about network theory, then we begin to talk about connectivities of those part and property in the systems. And I think you can apply that even when you're speaking about living and non-living system, because then you start to think of who are the agent, you know, like what role they play, what influence they have, and how they interact in that space. So yeah, I guess let's start broad and go down to unpack as we move. Yes, Linda.
Bridget had her hand up. Maybe she also wants to say something.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I didn't see that. Bridget, yes.
No worries. Mine was just, it was more in the conversation about breaking down living and non-living and how to define that. But I understand that is not, you know, the focus for today. So I'm fine with just tabling my question. It's not going to get us back to the guide.
Okay.
But I am interested in that. So if it is something that's a more dedicated conversation later, I think that could be a really cool thing to start breaking down.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, I appreciate that. Okay, so can we then move to talk about, so now that we've discussed, so we start unpacking complex systems. So we understand that when we talk about complexity, so we think of fundamental features. We talk about simple and complex systems, and what characterize that, what characterize simple and complex systems based on your understanding of the guide. Anyone want to share your thoughts?
I think it's about adaptation, non-linearity, emergence, and spontaneous order, or feedback systems or feedback loops, from what I saw from the guide. To my understanding.
Yeah, I think also from what I can see on your screen, simple systems also do have a smaller number of elements. And so the interactions and the interconnections between them does not really bring out the characteristic of complexity. So it's simple because it's just a few elements there. But when it comes to complex now, there are a lot more, and there are so many other interconnections between them. And those interconnections also cause certain behaviors within the system to emerge.
Yeah. Thanks. Anyone else? Well, I guess you just said it. It's exactly that. So it's when we deal with simple systems and complex systems, we're thinking now about, as I showed here, the number of parts, the degree of connectivity, the degree of interdependence, the degree of autonomy. So with complex systems, these things become highly connected and highly interdependent, and also to some degree, despite that they are highly interdependent, but they also operate autonomously. But yet in simple system, you just thinking more about cause and effect. So you take an action, you take an action and then you see the result, and that becomes like quite easier. Yet when you're dealing with complex system, you know that the parts are a lot. You need to know like how they are connected, roles that they are playing, and so on and so forth. And that's actually gets quite interesting, because if you get to that point, then you begin to see now the importance of why systems thinking can be useful in dealing with that kind of systems or complex systems. So complex systems have the properties of having many parts with high degree of connectivities, as I said. This interdependence between those set of parts, be it individual parts, they have high degree of autonomy, as I said. So the previous example that I was mentioning, traffic patterns, if I can put it like that, in Lagos, you see it being highly complex. There is no kind of simple equation that can describe something like that. And when you get to that point, then you begin to think of different model to understand this kind of organic patterns. And they are not very, very, they are not predictable. You can't really predict them. And this takes us to the next point, where we begin now to talk about self-organization, I mentioned. So under self-organization, so we're talking about patterns, how the patterns are formed, talking about organization and emergence, and all this together begin now to determine or characterize the kind of complex system you're dealing with. Any comment?
Well, on self-organization, I think when I was reading the guide, one of the examples that sort of came to my mind was protest. You know how protests happen. So initially there's an individual, probably, or a few individuals who have an idea, and then they have to share that idea with their peers, and they interact, and then some people come on board, and then they now plan, they coordinate, and then in that coordination, now they attract even more people, and then in the end, you have a protest. So for me, I feel like a protest sounded to me like an example of self-organization, looking at how our self-organization works.
That's an important point, Linda. Thank you so much. Anybody else want to comment on that? Self-organization, your understanding about that concept?
Okay. Hello, this is Tayona. Excuse the Samantha Sanamgra written there. I'm just using my wife's laptop.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's cool.
So,
welcome.
Yes, hi Linda. Good to see you. It's good to join this meeting. I might quickly dash out with my daughter's birthday today, and she's giving me hell.
Welcome.
Thank you. But I think for me, when I look at self-organization, I'm also looking at something that is leaderless. It can be organic, it can be natural, but it takes years and years of structure to become self-organized to the point where there's no leader. I can give a biblical example. There's a scripture in Proverbs that says, "The locusts have no king, yet they advance in ranks." So when I saw self-organization, that quickly jumped to my mind that it's something that is leaderless. The question then is that how do you get to that stage where there's no leader, but then somehow components of that system know what to do, when to do it, how to do it, without, and when to make decisions. Yeah, and I think in self-organization, there's also a concept of making decisions as a group. How do you make decisions as a group?
That's an
Thank you.
important point. Thank you so much. I like, anybody else? I like both points that you guys made. It's quite practical in the sense that because we're dealing with complex systems, and we understand that it's a type of system that has property and special features or special dynamics. These properties exhibit a type of behavior. And one of them is what we are calling now self-organization. They also have a network structure. They exhibit non-linearity. They evolve over time. So there is the point that we're making, the example that you gave, Linda, it's a good example because when you think about it, you see that there is no centralized entity that coordinates everything else, but there is order in the process. So we see patterns, correlations emerge to create order.
Yeah,
so
and also
like order. Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
Okay, and also in self-organization, there is dense peer-to-peer interactions between the elements in the system. So you'll find that information is normally flowing horizontally rather than vertically, and to allude to Tayona's point of saying that it's a leaderless system. Yeah, so the information is flowing horizontally. There is no leader who's bringing down instructions. It's just people working together. And well, in my example of protest, it's just people working together, sharing information and deciding on what they want to do.
Yeah, no, totally. And as we were speaking about order, yeah, so the other thing important about self-organization is order is created from the interaction between the parts. And I think scientists, they've studied these systems. We can take many examples like the flocking behavior with the fish. I don't know if I have it on my slide here, but the idea here is there is like local interaction and simple rules among the parts or between the parts as they interact. And that creates a sort of emergence. And it's organized, it's self-organized and create a sort of pattern organization. So order emerges out of disorder, if I can put it like that. So the system emerges from a disorder stage and gets organized into a number of distinct patterns. So yeah, so it's a sort of if I can put it like a sort of transition from an initially disorder state or high entropy state to a more low kind of entropy state as things organize themselves in the system. So in practice, if we think about it, what we have to keep in mind is we think of autonomous agents that operate under their own agenda or their own motive, and they are not constrained by anybody, just like we discussed in the previous example. But also there is a kind of peer interaction, and as Linda said, the kind of how information flows also. And that's create attractors. So and the attractor comes from the network effect driven by that kind of positive feedback. The next point that and I'm a bit worried about time, the next section that we explore here is in the guide that we're supposed to look is also non-linear system. Anybody want to try that and tell us what they understood by that concept of linearity and non-linearity? Okay, let me just try and illustrate the point that I was making here when I was talking about patterns. I found my slide again about self-organizations when I was talking about fish. So we see a process whereby novel features and property images, their parts come together, they interact and self-organize. So this is how the whole concept emerged to become self-organization.
Okay, maybe I'll have a go on non-linearity, right? But my thinking was to start by talking about the linear system and then move on to non-linearity. Yeah. So non-linear systems basically we're looking at something that is simple. It's just basically two principles, and those principles coming together and then becoming one. Whereas with non-linearity, it arises out of the interdependency of these elements within the system, and that in the interdependence over time will create feedback loops, meaning that one action by another element can cause another action, whether positive or negative, to another element. I don't know if that makes sense.
That makes sense, Linda. Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Yes, I would agree with Linda, actually. I was about to say my idea of a nonlinear system is a system where the change of the output is not proportional to the change of the input. So if we think about the butterfly effect, I don't know if you guys heard about that. But yeah, that was just my input.
Yeah, maybe you can explain a little bit about the butterfly effect, Lee.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. I was on mute.
Okay.
Okay, so the butterfly effect is, I think it's from chaos theory, if I'm not mistaken, and it's sensitivity to initial conditions. So it's basically a theory that says initial conditions, it's small change in one state can have like a massive effects down the line, if I'm right. That's my understanding. Sorry, you guys can just elaborate more.
Yeah, for sure. And to me, it sounds like something like a leverage point in a system. So that smaller action that you can take but can result in a bigger impact. Asen, there's a comment there in the chat box by Courtney. And she's saying that I think linear thinking negates a spectrum of engaging information or environments and insights that is accessible when engaging from a non-linear perspective. Yeah, Courtney, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah.
Maybe just say something.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Courtney, do you want to elaborate on that?
Oh, sorry, her mic isn't working. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay. No, but yeah, basically that's what it is. It's good to start by separating, making the difference between linearity and non-linearity, knowing that linearity is more characterized by a relationship of cause and effect, as I was saying earlier on. And the output of that process will be proportional to the input. And you also see that there will be a linear relationship between the input and the output. But the non-linearity, it's describe a relationship between the part that is not addictive. And I like the fact that that we need to emphasize the point of additivity, if I can put it like that, because it's not about adding or subscribing. So it's a process that sort of also a little bit linked to the self-organization. But part here, when we talk about non-linearity, we're thinking of a part in the system being not additive, and they result in a combined organization that is greater or less than the sum of its separated part, if we can put it of this. And a lot of these non-linearity come from the interdependency, again, as we were saying, between the part, and this interdependency creates synergies between them, which then create a relationship that makes the whole different from looking at the part as
yeah,
you.
and
yeah.
I also want to add something, Sen, and this is like to just put like a practical sort of perspective to it. Like looking at the work that I've done, like working in the NGO space, I've realized that when we are designing projects, we look at it's sort of most of us are still doing it in a linear way of understanding that this will do this activity and this activity will give us this result. We even have something that we call a logical framework. So that logical framework is basically telling you that this activity is going to give you this result. And I think it comes from dealing with simple systems. That is, when you're dealing with simple systems, that works perfectly because you got very few elements within the system, and you know exactly what, how the relationship between those elements in the system is, what it actually is going to bring out. But when it becomes complex now, that's when we're talking about non-linearity. Not every action that you take is going to give you the results that you want to see, or will actually give you something that you didn't even know. So, and I'll give an example of one of the projects that you actually did. It's in Zambia, I think, where you're working with young people in HIV and for them to access treatment. So within your log frame, you'll say that we have actually given treatment to this number of young people, and you tick the box, right? But you had a situation now where one of the young people actually died. They were not taking their medication. They were collecting it. So you were ticking the box, but they were not now taking it because they didn't have food. So the fact that they don't have food is part of that whole system of that you need to consider, but because everything is not linear. It's not linear. You need to factor in all of these things that are happening around. And so, yeah, I thought that could be an example of linearity and non-linearity and the challenges of linearity in project development. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's an important point, Linda. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so I think now that you touch on something quite important, Linda, maybe we should just talk about feedback, because as we were talking about linearity and non-linearity, so we also acknowledge the fact that there are some connections about feedback. There's negative and positive feedback, right? So but I think for the purpose of this, because we're talking about non-linearity, it's better for us to focus on the positive feedback. So when we are looking at non-linearity over time, it becomes about this feedback loop. Positive feedback loop means wanting to create more of another, which then feedback to create the first. Yeah, so when we're looking at non-linearity over time, a good example could be, a good example that I can think about now could be a compound interest. So if you have money in your bank account, that will create interest, and that interest will add more to the amount you have in your account, which then will create more interest, which then will add to that. And that will create basically what we call positive feedback. So the more is creating more. So when you have more, it's adding more, and that creates the non-linear process of change, because it is compounding upon itself. I think that's an important point that we also need to keep in mind as we're talking about linear and non-linear in that process. Yeah. So. Let me see, the next thing that we're looking at here is, what's the next thing that you guys also discovered in the guide without having to follow a sort of linear way of having this conversation?
Or without being linear.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, so chaos, I think Lee has already spoken a little bit about chaos, and chaos theory is also part of this guide. And when you're talking about chaos theory, you're basically looking at nonlinear dynamical systems that are highly sensitive to initial conditions. So an example could be the weather patterns. So you realize that weather patterns start and evolve over time until they also go down. So it could be in a tsunami, for example. So it will start from a small geographical space and then grow, and then over time it also gets to go down. So chaos also creates now a different kind of system. So after the whole weather pattern, like the tsunami that I've given as an example, so after the tsunami is gone, you now have a different sort of environment and a system that has been created by that chaos.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Then that's takes you now to begin to talk about phase transition also in that process. So if we have to go back a bit when we were talking about feedback, positive and negative feedback. So positive feedback, as you can see from the screen, in the nonlinear process of exponential change are inherently unsustainable, and they signify a phase of transition, which is a regime change from one state to another. The system grows hugely, but then crashes and end up in a new regime. So the good example here could be one regime creating the other regime. Is like, for instance, the whole story of water. You know, like you can have water at some point when it's frozen, it becomes an ice, and it changes the regime of the thing. So you can't just use it anymore like a liquid. And so that's an example of positive feedback and how it leads to an explosive growth, which then create or facilitate emergence of a different regime. Yeah, just to add on the points that you just made, Linda. So now that we've spoken about the phase transition, I think we should talk about the network theory. We will look at network theory, speak about network, and then maybe stop at adaptation and evolution. That's we can explore that in the next session because of time. Okay. So anybody want to share about the network theory?
Yeah, so I think network theory is basically about connectivity of elements within the system, right? And one example that comes to my mind of network is like the transport system at a global level. If you have to find something that is graphic that can show you how ships and aeroplanes and trains are moving across different places across the world, from Africa to Asia, and that shows like a very complex network of transport. And I think it's that connectivity, that connecting the world. And I think even from the internet is also a network, because it's connecting us. We are already in different places, but it's working to connect us. So yeah, so basically networking is about connecting, and the theory is talking about studying that connectivity. So what are the relationships as elements within a system get connected more and more?
Yeah, no, totally. I agree with you. I agree with you.
Yeah, and also to say what kind of a system will emerge as elements become more interconnected.
Yeah, yeah, true. So the network theory is another feature of complex systems, because we're still talking about complex systems, right? As you can see under complexity theory. So it's another feature of complex system. They have high degrees of connectivity, as you mentioned, Linda, and that gives them a network structure, as you said, rightly said. Network sciences, for many researchers, have become very popular, and they use it in many different areas, especially in social sciences, as we've been talking about now with the social network. It's more than a set of tools, as we talk about it. It's also a way of looking at the world. And here we're looking at a relational paradigm. Because network is really about connectivity, as I was saying in the beginning. Representing that connectivity is also the idea of architecture of complex systems. And that goes back to the network, as you were saying, the web network or telecommunication and whatever. So the whole idea of network is based upon the relational paradigm, as I said, because we are looking at the connection between the parts, and it becomes relevant once you turn up the connectivity in the system. When you have low level of connectivity, then you have also simple systems.
Yes.
And this is governed by properties of the part rather than the relationship between those parts. And when you look at the connectivity, it also becomes like this kind of network that shape the structure of the features of the system. You have to look at it in terms of these connectivities, which create different kind of space. You can say it as you're talking about mobile network. So here, the key feature here is we're looking at the typology of the network, which define how things plays out in that network.
And the dynamics, I think, also important to understand the dynamics that actually then form as the network grows and disintegrates. Exactly. And also the type of networks that come out of exactly.
The type of network is exactly that. So if we think of a logistic network in terms of airline transportation here in Africa, you will see that it's Linda, you know, we've done a lot of traveling on the continent, that it's more difficult to move across the African continent than it will be to move from Africa to Europe. And that is because of the connectivity of the network. It's well established there because of the needs, because of the demand. The typology shapes how things flow in and out, and also how close and far things are away from each other. So it's really important to start looking at the systems in terms of those connectivities and how that connectivity shape what could happen. Yeah. So this is an example of a network. As you can see, it says there are many ways of analyzing network. You can ask series of questions such as how connected it is, how long does it take to get from one side to the other, which actually define how close things are to each other. You can also think of the element, which one is very important. So if you're dealing with social network, which one is the most influential? I mean, if you look at the graphic that is here, we're talking about node, you know, so you might find that some node might have high degrees of connectivity, but they might not be most influential in the systems. So yeah, it's all those things.
We had a comment from Bridget earlier on. I'm just seeing it now, where she said linear also always makes me think more of mechanical systems, and this is very true. You know, I think in our previous learning meetup, Aseni gave the example of when a car part breaks down, all you need to do is to replace that car part, and then the car starts moving again, like everything goes back to how it's supposed to be. So yeah, linear is quite mechanical. Yeah,
perfect, cool, thank you. So we left with 8 minutes. I think we can talk briefly about adaptation and evolution. This is the last wing. as we're discussing. But I think this one, we don't have time to unpack it today because this is basically the complex adaptive systems, right? So maybe we can just ask a question, you know, an example of an adaptive system that you guys know. I know weather is one. Society is an example of adaptive system. Economy, transportation. What else? Any other example?
Yeah, I think maybe before examples, we might need to just understand what a complex adaptive system is. Yeah, and it's my understanding is that it's a system that changes its behavior in response to the to the environment. Yeah. Exactly. So if you give an example of the economy, there are so many activities like or events that happen that actually then change things that will be happening within the economy. And I'll give the example of what is happening now globally because of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So you understand that now the food system is being affected by that, meaning the economy is also, so there's a lot of things that are happening that are coming from the effect of that conflict. So the economy becomes a complex adaptive system.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's exactly what you said, Linda. So they are adaptive. They are adaptive systems, and they evolve over time, like you rightly said. And how those systems are shaped is a lot to do with how the parts adapt and interact locally. So if you get to dig into that and try to understand it, then it has to do with sort of local logic of agents. If it's a finance system, if you're dealing with the finance systems, you're thinking of the agent in that system. You've got banks, you've got, so you've got government, you've got, there are many. So it's really about how they adapt and how they interact in that system. And this evolved from the area of cybernetic, which is studying control or regulatory system in mechanical or technology, any other field that you can think about it. Yeah, so in the financial market system, for example, you see traders going through a feedback process of regulation and control and optimization. What they try to do there is they want to get the outcome that they want based on algorithm or more advanced schemas. So if you begin to talk about those complex adaptive systems, then you need to understand to a certain extent, you need to understand it to a certain extent because it's a lot of what shapes the actual outcome. That's a very important point. And to think of the rules under which those agents in the system are acting or even are interacting among them or each other. And this brings other concepts like the game theory that we can explore in the next session. Game theory and also evolution theory. But basically, just briefly, maybe to mention before we get there, since I mentioned it, is the game theory is really, it studies the situation of strategic interaction between adaptive agent and the dynamics of cooperation and competition that emerge out of that. These agents in the system have their own agenda, as you know. So if you're working in the bank system or if you're an entrepreneur, you get into a space where you have to interact. So you understand that everybody's got their own agendas, interest differs. They interact with each other and form part of a competition or kind of cooperation, depending on how they define those relations. And so this game theory is really a study of structures that leads to cooperation or competition. Yeah, and then, and then the other feature is the evolution, which is complex adaptive system change on a micro level to a process of evolution. So as we were saying, with the self-organization, there is nobody who's controlling this process. It's just evolve as it goes. I know there was a lot to cover. I see Bridget said you once studied game theory in light of vaccine acceptance. Yeah. I would love to have that conversation.
Me too.
Actually, I would like to hear more from you.
But it was a while ago, but yeah, it's definitely relevant now. I think about that project a lot.
Yeah, we can have a meet and greet in our channel. We can organize and expand more on this. So as I was saying, thank you so much, guys, for making the time. This is a very heavy guide. I think when we started talking about it, we all felt like 1 hour was not enough to cover all the features, but at least we try to talk about the key principles or basic concept of systems complexity theory. So in the next session, we'll explore complex adaptive systems. So how the element in the system evolve over time and how they create an emergent system that can be understood well when we are dealing with complexity. So that's what we'll be covering in the next guide. Thank you so much for making the time. We're running out of time, and then we'll see you again in the next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you
So much for your contributions. Bye-bye. Thank you all for your input.
Bye-bye.